This is the second lecture burst for Chapter 11, Groups and Individuals. And this one picks up with the last basic feature of a group, which is norms. And we learned a lot about norms in Chapter 8 when we talked about social influence. Norms dictate how we act in society, so groups are just the same. They follow along with norms. And so in a group, norms are going to dictate how members of that group should and should not act. And so this is a very powerful feature of a group. If you're going to be a part of this group, you got to play by the rules. You got to follow the norms. You have to adhere to those norms in order to gain what we talked about last, which is status, and to be rewarded, to move up in rank in a group, or position, or power, or influence. This can also, though, depend on collectivism and individualism. And we've talked about these concepts before, but these are societal concepts that are moderated, or moderate, I should say, how norms play out. So in collectivistic groups, the norm is to maintain group harmony among group members, even if doing so might entail some sort of personal costs, like those high personal costs. In these kind of groups, disagreement and conflict among members is really to be avoided. They try really hard not to let this happen. And in individualistic groups, in individualistic societies, the norm is to value standing out from the group and to be different from others. So here, the individual variability is more to be expected. And disagreeing with the group is often seen as courageous. We respect that. And it can win you a seat at the quote-unquote head of the table, right? It's how you gain power. But that wouldn't work in a collectivistic society that values the harmony of the group. It doesn't want its individual members trying to outshine one another. So really, the norms are important to look at in the context of the greater society in which the group is functioning. Okay, now we're going to turn to looking at how does a group influence individual behavior. And there's many different ways. We're going to look at some concepts here. One is social facilitation. And this is the tendency to perform better when around others. So performance can be enhanced when we're doing something we're good at, or something that we've done a lot of, something that we've practiced. We would consider this a dominant response that we have. But our performance is hindered when we're doing something new, novel, or complex that maybe we haven't done before, or it takes a lot to do. So in that case, the physiological arousal we get from, say, maybe an audience might provoke a lot of anxiety, and we might not have enhanced performance. So this follows along Zajanc's drive theory, just stating that familiar or simple tasks will be facilitated by the group. So the individual's performance will be facilitated by the group when you're doing something familiar or similar. It will be hindered by the group if the individual is doing something unfamiliar or difficult. So this relates to apprehension, particularly evaluation apprehension, as well as what's called distraction conflict theory. So with evaluation apprehension, some people have found that even sometimes when we're doing a task that we know really well, we might have some apprehension about our performance being evaluated. And this definitely is the case. I've seen this happen so many times just being in grad school. In grad school, we had to give quarterly talks. So every quarter, we would have to give a research talk in front of everyone, all the faculty and all the grad students in the department. It was very intimidating, scary. You had to know your stuff. and you knew you were being evaluated. So it wasn't just, oh, get up there and talk because, this is fun to do. It was, you're being evaluated for your ability to talk in front of others, your ability to explain research. And so you're up there explaining what you had done that quarter in your lab, so to speak. And so, at first it was really intimidating. You're being evaluated and such, but over time, as you do this again and again and again, it becomes a little easier to do, and you're not as scared, you're not as anxious. Distraction conflict theory states that the presence of others can be distracting, really. And for this reason, it can cause what they say is cognitive overload. So in this situation, social facilitation stems from the conflict produced when an individual attempts to simultaneously pay attention to other people who are present and then the task being performed. Okay. And so that conflict, you want to reduce that conflict so that the goal is to not let the two compete. Focus on the task being performed. Don't pay attention to the other people in the audience who are there and can distract you and cause you to maybe not perform as well. We know that even experienced athletes typically feel more driven to succeed when they're being watched. Many a coach's dilemma when his or her team members are not performing very well on their own in practices, but then when the big game comes, they do perform. The simple presence of others, is the mere presence of others, causes a physical arousal. It gets the hormones going, the adrenaline, all of that, and it can facilitate our performance. If we have evaluation apprehension, we might be feeling judged. That can enhance self-consciousness and lead to poorer performance, which sometimes is the case for performers, singers, dancers, and even athletes, right, can have that evaluation apprehension. But what we see typically, especially in athletes, is just, the presence of the crowd really drives people to want to do better. So social facilitation states that when the going gets tough, right, if it's a task you've done many times and you're good at, the crowd is going to work in your favor. It can propel you to excel at the task. But if it's something you're not comfortable doing, say giving a speech in front of the class, that the presence of the crowd is actually going to inhibit you. You're not going to do as well. And we see that's the case, with a performer like Beyonce. She thrives on the crowd and she does very well, versus, a little kid giving a speech in class, which he's not used to doing. Two totally different variables, and seeing how the crowd affects our behavior, or in other words, how the group affects our behavior. Another way the group influences individual behaviors through social loafing. I posted a video about this this week. It has to do with a classic study in social loafing involving kind of like a tug of war type of situation. I have a little video, or not a video, a slide here. When blindfolded, students were led to believe that others were pulling behind them in a game of tug of war, and they exerted less effort when they thought other people were pulling behind them versus when they knew they were pulling alone. So the strange thing happens where being in a group can cause a decrease in the effort that we put forth. And it's seen more so when individual performance is not assessed. If you're being graded on a group project and your individual efforts aren't going to be seen, research shows you're going to put less in, okay? And there's where we find that one person doesn't always pull his or her own weight. And again, this depends on culture. So it's always embedded within the greater culture in which we live. And unfortunately, we see this more in individualistic cultures like our own, where a lot of value and emphasis is put on the self, the individual contribution, okay? When we're in a group and our individual effort isn't going to be noticed, but the effort of the group as a whole will be noticed, isn't it sad that we don't contribute as much? It's like, well, if my efforts can't be seen, then I'm just going to do, the minimal. It's like we don't value how well the group does. We won't put in 100% so that our group shines. No. We'll only do that if I'm going to shine. If my individual behavior is going to be seen, then I'll put the effort in. So it's kind of sad. In collectivistic cultures, the individual's role isn't as great. I might get nothing out of this project personally, but the group will. The group will benefit greatly. And so I'm going to work real hard to make sure that the group benefits greatly. So it's a mindset. It depends on the greater culture in which we live. So to decrease social loafing, researchers have found some elements that work. You're going to want to increase the level of individual commitment, increase the importance of the tasks that individuals are doing, and make each person in the group, their personal contributions, stand out. If you have those three elements, you're going to do better to have groups that work better together. So whenever I do group projects in a class, I make sure each person has their own piece that they're responsible for, that they commit to, and it's easily identifiable, and that tends to help a little bit. Groups also influence behavior of the individual via de-individuation, and we've talked about this when we talked about social influence. We tend to let go of our own self-awareness and restraint that we might have as an individual, and we tend to go along with the group when we are a part of groups. And this can be because of the sense of anonymity we feel when we are within a group. We tend to feel sheltered by the group, like, I won't get in as much trouble if everyone in the group is doing it. What, are they going to arrest all of us? Yeah. So it relates to social identity theory that we learned about back in chapter 8. De-individuation results from a shifting of identity away from ourselves and onto the group. And an individual changes their focus from self to group. And it leads to conformity to the norms of the group, which, as we are seeing, is important that we follow the norms of the group if we want to stay in the group and we want to increase status in the group. But it can lead to a loss of self-awareness, right? So Zimbardo talks specifically about de-individuation because it was a big element in the Stanford Prison Study, which we're going to look at. And he said that, it really happens, de-individuation really happens in a group when you have high arousal, like high feelings, like lots of emotions going on. Anonymity, like you're not going to be singled out or picked out. Reduced feelings of responsibility, like, well, I'm not calling the shots, so, the responsibility falls on the leader or the teacher or my parents. And this can lead to very dangerous behaviors. And I see I spelled that wrong. That's awesome. And we see this leading to dangerous behaviors in many different ways. Definitely in cult behaviors, which we looked at in chapter 8, kind of the obedience that happens in cults. But it also can happen in situations like the LA riots, where we saw a lot of violent behavior occurring in masses because the individual was removed from the consequences of their actions. And it really, the group took over, and it was this sort of mob mentality that we hear about. Mob mentality is de-individuation at its finest. But it even happens in kids. So there's something really essential here. Children who are in costumes that cover their faces will grab more candy out of a bowl at trick-or-treating than if they're easily identifiable, right? And this was study done a long time ago, but it really shows anonymity, reduction in self-awareness, in social identity.